We just were going to kind of have an open forum here, a few questions, and certainly anybody in the audience that has any things they want to ask John about his time on the NTSB or his outlook as far as the industry goes, feel free. So, and maybe I'll just start out. So, John, you know, it's interesting to hear from you. So, how did you get involved in the NTSB to begin with?
You want to go back to the beginning? You know, it's funny, in life, it's funny how different things happen and you really have no control over them. When I was about 13 and a half or 14 years old, our local library was a bookmobile. And I'm a person that likes to read. Even to this day, I travel with 50 pounds of reading material on every flight. And I keep pissing and moaning because my bag's so heavy.
You haven't upgraded to the iPad yet, then,
No.
is that it? Okay.
No, old school. I have a pad, but... So anyway, the guy who drove the bookmobile had a diving business. And back in the 50s, you know, that wasn't a job. That was a passion because you couldn't make any money at it. But he convinced me and my parents to let me learn how to scuba dive. And I did. Well, in 1960, I had been really digging into the scuba diving in the summer. I worked for him in the summer. One night, at like 6 o'clock at night, the phone rings, and it's him, Jim Walton. He ultimately became quite infamous in New England for diving. Jim Walton. And he asked me if I had any gear, and I had 3 sets all ready to go. He says, I'll be down to pick you up. So he says, haul it outside. So I haul it outside. I lived in the city. Haul this stuff out to the curb. And I hear a siren. Now, I already knew by then a plane had crashed at Logan, which was in my backyard virtually. And here comes the police car, and it's him in it. And they threw all my gear in the car and myself, and away we went. And that was my first voluntary ride in a police car. Growing up in the city, I'd been in many police cars, but that was the first one I got in on my own. And off we went, and I dove on the crash of Eastern Airlines Electra. It killed a whole bunch of people. And so now that's 1960. Fast forward to 72, I do my first real crash with an NTSB investigator who I knew, and it was a GA crash. And then I did some other ones, and then I did some U.S. Air accidents and some Flying Tigers, and you know, just sort of built on it until finally I ended up in Washington doing a lot of other things and got recognized and ended up at the NTSB. You know, nothing happens in Washington if you're not connected. Somehow, they don't pick your name out of a hat and say, okay, this guy would be good, even if you have the best resume. Because in Washington, everybody has something to say. So all the alphabet groups will, if they don't like you, will raise that issue. And politicians, being politicians, they won't take anything that's controversial. So, and many people have said about my nomination, I was the union guy on the board. But the truth be known, I had one union that supported me. But I had GAMA, I had the ATA, I had a number of airlines, and I guess Carol Hallett, who was the president of the ATA, said it best. She was quoted in the newspaper because they kept probing me. And the question was about me, about my nomination, and her answer was, it's not that we're in love with Goglia, but we know he won't blow in the wind like a willow. And I think that was a fair assessment because I have an opinion, it's based on facts, and I don't give... I see the camera over there now.
It's not the news, it's us.
And I really don't care what anybody thinks. I have an opinion. And I tell the industry, I told the industry at that time, if I'm off the wrong track, it's as much my fault as yours, because my door's open. Come straighten me out beforehand. I drove my fellow board members and other people in government nuts because I would answer my phone. I actually got a lecture once from somebody at the board about my answering my phone. And I got pretty irate about it. You know, I had a rule in my office that the phone was answered on the 3rd ring. And there was 4 of us. And that meant sometimes I had to answer the phone because we had 5 lines. Right? And I would answer the phone often. And my home phone number was listed. I got a lecture about that too. these people pay my salary. At least I owe them a hello. You know, if I don't like what they're saying, I can hang up.
Sure.
I don't have to hide, but that's some of the ways of Washington.
Sure. So, John, as a board member, then is it safe to say you were responsible for investigating airline accidents, general aviation, corporate aviation, or rotorcraft, or was it specific to one segment?
One of the beauty of the position of a board member is you can do any of the modes. You know, the NTSB does planes, trains, buses, boats, pipelines, and bridges. Well, I never did any bridge, but we had that big event in Minnesota on the bridge. But we had all modes, and I like the railroads because the railroads have my kind of attitude, which I won't expound upon too much because the camera's up there. But essentially, they own the train, they own the land the train is on. As soon as the train crashes, they buy the train, the contents of the train, because you declared the value of what you shipped. So they buy the entire train of goods. So now everything's theirs. So essentially, they tell you what they'd like you to do.
Well, that's interesting.
But I like that direct approach. So I liked working with the railroads. And ironically, I did a heck of a lot of railroad accidents, some big ones. And back in the days when I was at the board, because of the Union Pacific and the Burlington Northern, two separate mergers, Burlington Northern merged with Santa Fe, and Union Pacific merged with one of the other. I forget. Anyway, we were having a major train crash every 5 days. And since we only killed the crew, which is either 2 or 3 people, it never even made much splash in the papers. But I got to work a lot with the railroads, and I like those guys.
That's interesting.
And I did some boats too. But
so one of the questions I have regarding aviation accidents is, so what determines who's going to investigate an accident? Because there's multiple authorities involved. You have the FAA, you may have the local law authority, you may have the FBI, the NTSB. So how does that work when there's an aviation accident of who does what?
The enabling legislation that created the NTSB gave the agency very, very broad authority. And it was cleaned up a little bit after TWA because the FBI, we had a little tete-a-tete with the FBI. And we'll get into that maybe later if somebody has an additional question. But the authority is broad. But the agency right now has about 420 people in it. You can't do every accident. And that includes all the other modes. And I would, as a rough guess, say 250 of those 420 are aviation related. And that includes clerical help, you know, people who have to administer the paying all the bills for when there's an accident and all of that. So you had this pool of accident investigators, stationed, many of them stationed around the country, and it's a question of location of the accident and workload on the individual investigator. Now, you can imagine that the office in New Jersey doesn't have a lot of work in the wintertime, because there's not a lot of flying, GA flying, and there's not a lot of accidents. But the guys in California and Arizona, they handle it pretty well. Most of the investigators that are on the West Coast are running with between 20 and 25 open accident investigations at any one time. So it's a little difficult job to do, trying to keep it all straight and where it is. And they make mistakes sometimes. And it actually, the mistakes go right through the system because there's only a single guy person investigation. And frankly, the QA on it is a little lacking. So, people that are involved in it, I tell people come to me complaining about the process after the fact. You really need to get in there before the fact and raise these issues if you're involved with one. Raise your concerns with them because they will get addressed. They will get noticed, and somebody will take a look at it. Well, but after the fact, it's not very good.
That's one of the things, correct me if I'm wrong, that the NTSB does, based off trends, accident data, and whatever, is to then make recommendations to, in the case of aviation, the FAA, correct? To make corrections. And how does that process work? And I guess maybe the second part of it is are those recommendations versus are they mandatory fixes?
Well, I'll answer the second part first. No, they're not mandatory. When I first went to the board, I thought that I would have liked to see more authority given to the NTSB on their recommendations. But after working under the system, I figured out that it's better to have it just recommendations. Now, the way the system is supposed to work is when the NTSB makes a recommendation to the FAA has 90 days to answer us on what they're going to do. And usually the answer is, we're looking at it and we need more time. And it goes forward from there. What's missing that was there in the beginning that's not there today is a give and take. Because the FAA was not reacting in a timely way, the NTSB recommendations got a little stronger. And the give and take still didn't occur. So right now what you find is the recommendations really reach. They really reach out there to try to push the FAA through Congress, rather than have the give and take between our people, the NTSB people, and the FAA people. Out of those 250 people at the NTSB, there are maybe 70 or so people that have a view of aviation that's about this wide. They know a hell of a lot about a little. I mean, really a hell of a lot. They're smart people about a given piece. If left to their own devices, whatever their opinion is of a safety improvement, they cripple the industry because they are so focused on the piece. So one of the roles of the board members is supposed to be to smooth that out and really modify those recommendations to make it to something that's doable. And I can remember a couple of recommendations that came up. One was on big engines. They wanted actually a tear down after 1,800 hours to do an inspection on CF6. Come on, 1,800 hours. You know what the cost is? It's $1 million just to take it off the wing, tear it down, and put it back together without nothing. I mean, it's O-rings and gaskets. I mean, that would cripple the industry. And I remember going ballistic over that one and had little go-arounds. And another one that sticks in my mind is on airplanes with Tundra tires. Tundra tires do a job on the airplane. So one of our mental giants had a recommendation come out that every airplane in the country needed to go through this elaborate inspection in case it ever had Tundra tires on it.
In case it ever had.
Yes. I said, you got to be kidding me. I said, when airplanes go to Alaska and they get Tundra tires on, they don't come back. They're up there, they fly the hell out of them, and then they die up there. And we're going to go through the rest of the 180,000 airplane fleet. I don't know how many are single-engine airplanes, but the rest of those airplanes are going to have to suffer through these inspections. The annual inspection, somebody told me, the annual inspection on a Cessna would then cost more than you could buy the airplane for.
Could very well be.
Because you'd have to remove most of the landing gear to do the inspections. And it was NDT inspections on top of it. I mean, it's crazy. But that's because this guy's got this little view of the world, and to make it safe, that's what we really got to do. Well, give me a break.
Yeah.
You know, you got to balance this stuff out.
So, when there's an accident investigation, there's usually one focal point called the investigator in charge. Is that correct?
That's a big investigation, right?
And that seems to be quite a high visibility, high pressure sort of position during an investigation. Can you just talk a little bit about what all that person has to manage in a big investigation?
And that's the right word, manage. You know, as you come through the NTSB process and ultimately get to be an investigator in charge, which is only 6 or 7 of them, they actually manage an accident site. Do you think that, you know, Greg Fife is probably one of our most famous investigators, you know, in ValueJet, the press coined him the mud stud because he would show up in his tailored flight suit, and he's a good-looking guy and he's articulate, there's no question. All right, but the female press had a good time with him. But he managed an accident. Did he know anything about DC-9s when we had that accident? He didn't know about that much, right? But we brought in all the parties to the investigation: Douglas, the FAA, the airline, If there was a union, and there wasn't in that case, if there was a union, it'd be the union would have some mechanics there. So you would have all this talent with all this knowledge, and what you're doing is managing it. You're reaching out to these people and getting the information, knowing full well that every one of the parties to the investigation have a vested interest and have an opinion that may be biased because of where they come from. So that is the role of the IIC, to weigh those out. You know them up front, and you weigh that out. And it may mean, if you don't have a very big, broad group to work with, it may mean that after the facts come out, and that if the pilot group or the mechanics group or the company had said something, that you may have to reach out to somebody else to balance off that information. That's the role of the IIC. He has absolute authority. He has authority to spend money. You know, one of the things that I loved about being a board member is I got to sign the subpoenas. And I love that when we had corporate attorneys that would come in and try to position and they're going to tell us what to do, and I would just, okay, you can say whatever you want, but I turn to the lawyer and say, give me a subpoena, because we're going to get the information one way or the other. And then when I was a wise guy with them, if they were resisting, I would tell them, I said, I want you to meet my new best friends. They're called the Federal Marshal Service. They'll give you the subpoena.
So John,
but that didn't happen very often. But those were some of the fun things.
This show here is all about a lot of ground support, equipment, airport operations, and of course aircraft maintenance. So maybe we can just speak a little bit, and we'll start with maintenance because, of course, both of us are maintenance folks. When there is an accident and an investigation takes place, from a maintenance perspective, what sort of items and things are the investigating team looking at with regards to that aircraft and how it has been maintained?
In the big airplane business, we want the records. And most of the airlines today have computer-generated records. So usually before the team is even on the site, we've already had the records electronically sent to us. So we have people looking at them to understand what was done to the airplane. In fact, while you were with Northwest, you had that engine that came off in Narita, Japan.
Yeah, I remember, unfortunately.
And we had, under the rules, ICAO rules for international investigations, we had a group of people on an airplane that's someplace over the Pacific when the Japanese came back, and we knew because we had the records that this airplane had been in maintenance just out.
Yep.
They come back and told us that they had seen a flaw with some of the maintenance that was done. And then we immediately dispatched another team from Washington to Minneapolis, and now we don't want any longer the electronic generated documents. We want the greasy fingerprint documents. We want the ones where the individual signed, and then we're going to talk to the individuals.
Sure.
What we did. So there is an escalation depending upon what you find in the circumstances. And in that case, that was very material to the accident, but it could have been a dead end too. It could have been nothing at all. But what I saw from when I first went to the board through the period of time, the 9 years, from 95 to 04, what I saw is an increase in the maintenance involvement in accidents. As we drove down the other factors in accidents, both the pilot involvement in accidents with human factors, mostly in the pilot side, and mistakes in the hangar or during maintenance, both grew as a percentage of accidents, because the accident rate went down, the number of accidents went down. But the spotlight had grown on what we do as wrench turners and what we do as pilots. And pilots, some of the thought processes that the pilots were going through in accidents leave you shaking your head. But some of the things that we do in the hangar also leave you shaking your head. And even after I've left the board, I've continued to be involved with the maintenance piece. And I'm involved with a lot of interesting cases around maintenance and IA. And sometimes we're not the smartest guys in the world. We make some pretty stupid mistakes.
Yeah. So what can you talk about on the equipment side? Look around us. We have all sorts of ground support and aircraft support equipment. So in an accident investigation, certainly there could be a fueling component, a handling
Right
component,
there.
you name it.
At the icing bucket. I had two very interesting accidents involving airplanes that after the crash, the people on the FBO facility said they knew it was going to happen because the airplane was iced up and never said a damn thing. And one of them, I don't know, Saturday Night Live was Eversole. Dick Eversole was the VP from NBC who developed that program. I mean, it's a great show. I'm sure everybody's watched it. He lost his son in one of those accidents for de-icing. And in that case, the flight crew did almost all their flying in northern and South America. They never saw ice. In the charter company they worked for, they ended up moving to Colorado in the wintertime. Didn't de-ice the airplane, and the folks at the FBO hard-wing airplane. They saw the contamination on the wing and never said a word. It drives me crazy. Now, I don't know whether it's because I've got a big mouth, but when I worked at FBOs, I would make all sorts of noise over that.
Sure.
But here's these guys, they saw it and they didn't do anything. So there's an element that hopefully SMS is going to fix that, and some human factors training is going to fix it, where we actually reward, not only just encourage, but reward people for opening their mouth when they see something. I mean, because you know that it's a risk to the airplane, you can't just sit there and let it go. Jesus, you need to do something.
It's attention to detail, no matter if you're a pilot or a fueling servicing person or a technician. So
Fueling, how many airplanes have we had wrong fuel put in?
Well, and I was just going to roll into that one. Fueling certainly has to be looked at hard and heavy during any investigation, I'm sure, whether it's the type of fuel, the quality of the fuel, the maintenance and upkeep of the
How much fuel?
program, that the QC programs.
I haven't looked lately, but not too long ago, we still had 600 airplanes crash a year because of no fuel. Now, how stupid is a pilot when he lets himself run out of fuel? But
I can.
we're
I
going
think
to
I
save
can.
5 cents by.
I think I can make it.
Yeah, right. Or they say, "Oh, I go back to my home field. It's 10 cents a gallon cheaper."
Yeah.
Yep.
So certainly, if anybody has any questions or comments they'd like to make, I have a microphone here, or in the front row here. Certainly, you can just ask John
give him
anything.
the
Here we go,
microphone.
ma'am. Right here.
Hi, thank you. Mark Mullen, FedEx Express Air Safety. Mr. Goglia, again, it's a privilege to meet with you again and speak with you. One of the things I wanted to mention that at FedEx we try to push safety as a value, and when you speak about a de-ice employee who doesn't mention anything to the flight crew or anything or anybody that, hey, you've got ice on your wing, whatever, and they let it go, a lot of people, they don't want to be that one person who stops that airplane from making their scheduled departure. And it's unfortunate. It happens in the industry. You see it at a bunch of other airlines. And like I said, one of the things at FedEx that we value is our mission is the world on time, and we provide it. That's one of our greatest values, but we also push safety as a value, because when a company says that safety is their number one priority, well, for those that don't know, priorities change with circumstances, and values, they remain constant within somebody. So you can see the difference, because today your priority might be saving money. When the economy had its downturn, a lot of companies said, okay, our number one priority is to cut costs. So when we value safety, you're putting greater, well, like I said, value on it. So that's one thing that we push at FedEx is, if you've got to throw up the red flag and say, hey, stop, we will stand behind you 100% to support that value.
Well, that's great, and that's the way it should be. And John, maybe you can talk a little bit. You mentioned SMS, but I know you've done a lot of work with safety management systems and such. And can you just kind of maybe give us a bit of an update of how SMS in the aviation world is going and where it's headed?
Want to buy my books?
Can I get your autograph
can I
and
plug
the
my
inside
books?
cover?
you know, we've had a lot of programs come and go in aviation. I had a lot to do with human factors when it came in the 90s. In fact, some of my friends that like to give me the little jab, call me the grandfather, not the father, the grandfather of human factors. Because I started the very first program. I was one of several that started it. But that was just the beginning. SMS, safety management systems, I think are the future. You know, are they the one program that's going to end all? No, they're not. It's not going to fix everything we have in this business, but it's going to take us to the next step. And 5 years from now or 10 years from now, after we've worked through SMS, and maybe something else that's going to take us even further. But it is a process in which we start to involve everybody. SMS, to work right, involves every vertical silo in the company. You know, you've got your case, you've got the cargo loaders, you got people on the inside doing weight and balance and other things, figuring out what's going to go where, what container's going to get what. You know, we've got the maintenance piece, you've got the pilot piece, you've got all these vertical silos. And we've done a lousy job over the years talking across those silos in the airlines, especially on these kinds of issues. So SMS is really going to drive it across. And because when somebody puts that hand up, their flag, and says, I have a problem, it's going to get recorded. And what you do about it's going to get recorded. And when that hand goes up with somebody else later on the same event, now you're going to go back and say, well, we looked at this once before, and maybe we did nothing, or we only did this, and now it's going to drive additional change. So over time, SMS is really going to change a lot of our processes. You know, one of my frustrations going to accident scenes when it involved maintenance, and sometimes pilots, but the comments that would come from people, we knew that was going to happen sooner or later.
Yeah, so
Well,
why?
Why are we here? If you knew it was going to happen, and sometimes it's, well, I told my supervisor. And we learned when we put the human factors program in the very beginning, in the early 90s, the supervisors are ill-prepared to deal with those issues. There's no training given to most supervisors on how to deal with those issues. They're there to help production along, keep things moving. And we have not invested in that first-line management and teaching them how to behave, how we want them to behave, and not just behave, how we as a corporation or as a society, if it's FAR issue, how we want them to behave to deal with them. So SMS is also going to drive that in with the training piece. So I believe it's the answer that we need for the next generation or two, at least. I just heard recently that the rule for us in 121 carriers is going to be out in August, and there'll be an implementation period on top of that. But finally, we're going to start getting progress. The rest of the world is already further along. Australia and Canada have very active programs, and not without problems, but at least the process is there, and it's going to improve. And just the fact that we have to record the issue and what we did with it is going to improve a lot. You know, how many of you here have struggled with the maintenance manuals on airplanes, right? In a word, they're
Careful, John.
Yep. I wish we didn't have that thing. They're not the best in the world. Right? And getting changes are so difficult. Well, SMS is going to push that burden back up the chain on who's responsible, right? And fix it. I mean, why do we continually have new guys in particular making the mistake that this old gray hairs made 20 years ago? Because
Sure.
they look at the manual, they try to follow the manual, and the manual's wrong.
Yeah.
Or you don't understand the manual. It's written so lousily. You know, and people don't realize a flight operations manual, every single word is vetted. If you want to change the letter A to the word THE, that has to go through a process. Maintenance manuals are just put out there. Nobody looks at them after the guy who wrote them. They're accepted documents by the FAA, which is a legal term that the FAA has no responsibility for them.
Yeah, and that's a whole nother discussion.
Right.
You can get in between the interpretation of accepted and approved. And
Yes, I just spent 3 days in Atlanta with the FAA on that one.
how about anybody else have any comments or questions they'd like to make? You know, feel free. It's your chance to talk to Mr. Goglia here?
Talk to John.
Talk to John. Ask the investigator. So what can you tell us, certainly, if there's any kind of advice you can, leave us all with regards to, let's just say, unfortunately, accidents do happen, and we may find ourselves as one of the folks involved in perhaps the last fueling of the aircraft or some of the last maintenance on the aircraft. What could you tell us, John? What kind of advice could you give us?
Well, if the NTSB comes knocking, the system really wants you to be open and honest. If you're anything less than that, it's going to come to light, and then you're going to find yourself in a worse place. Right? The NTSB has no enforcement authority. So if they do come, normally there's an FAA person with them. There's two things that you can do. One is you can have anybody with you that you want. It can be a lawyer, it can be somebody you work with. All right? So you can bring somebody with you. And the second thing is, and I tell everybody to do this, is throw the FAA out. You'll say, I'm willing to talk to the FAA, to the NTSB, but I don't want the FAA present. And that'll happen. Because oftentimes what happens, and it's tough to prove this, but I've seen it enough to believe it's true. The FAA cannot use anything that's raised in the port for enforcement in the part of the NTSB investigation. But now, the FAA is sitting next to me when I ask you a question and you tell them that you did something wrong. He goes back and tells somebody in the FAA, who now comes out and does an investigation on what you just said. So they're not using his information. They're going to develop the same information separately. So you're just better off isolating yourself from the FAA and all that process.
Another question that I have sometimes is wonder about. There's so many aviation authorities around the world anymore, and as we all know, aviation is such a global industry. EASA, FAA, Transport Canada, JCAB, you name it. So how do those organizations kind of work together, I guess, if you will? Is there a lot of international partnering, if you will, between aviation authorities goes on around the world?
Yes, there is a lot of partnering. On the accident investigation side, many of those organizations were trained by the NTSB. The French DGAC, they sent people over when they were building up their accident investigation piece. They had people that would work with and in the NTSB for 6 months to a year, understanding our process. That happens from many different countries. Today with ICAO, there's a lot of them standing up their own investigative bodies, and they're damn good. The French are good, the Brits are good, the Australians are good. They're good at what they do. They have the authority. One of the disadvantages that most of them have is it's criminal activity, and we would go crazy with that kind of a process in this country. But it's controlled by the judges.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that you bring up, and as we all know, there are criminal charges that get brought by foreign authorities.
Yes. And pilots, I tell pilots all the time to get the hell out of the country if they have an accident. Right? And interestingly, those two guys down in Brazil,
sure,
they had a day and a half before the government started to sniff around, and they were confined to their hotel at first. They should have been talking to them from Argentina. It's only an hour away.
Sure.
And 2 hours by car. They should have been out of there.
Tim, did you have a question?
Hi, John. Tim Fay from Alaska Airline Maintenance. I had a question about, you're talking about global, everything's going global, including outsourcing aircraft maintenance. A lot of maintenance is done in South Korea, China. If there's an accident that the NTSB is involved in, and you were talking about going out and getting the actual task cards or the work cards with the greasy pins on it, how would you do something that's done overseas if there's an accident?
We've done that. In fact, while I was at the board, we had a JTAD that went boom on takeoff and killed a couple of people. And that particular piece of the engine that went boom, at high rotational speed, was manufactured in Sweden. We sent the bits and pieces to our lab in Washington. You and I pay for this. And under the microscope, those metallurgists, who I have a great deal of respect for the metallurgists, what they can tell you from looking at a piece of metal is amazing. But what that metal told us is that this crack, they counted the gyrations, which is a cycle, thermal cycle on it, and that this crack was there at the time of manufacture of the part. So it was a Pratt & Whitney engine. We went to Pratt. Pratt told us that part was manufactured in Sweden. We sent a team to Sweden. We brought our own interpreters with us, went over there, and we went after the manufacturing paperwork, and we found the problem. So we have the right under ICAO in the part of an investigation to do that. Of course, the Swedish authorities were there to enforce that. All right, but there's a level of cooperation between the investigators and almost all the countries, especially those that have signed the ICAO protocols, to actually reach in and get that information.
Okay, thanks. And then is there any update on remember when the Air France Concorde crashed, France was going after the Continental mechanics. Is there any update on that you know of?
Well, those guys can't go to France.
Right.
The two guys.
Yeah.
All right, so there's criminal charges pending against them over there.
Yeah.
And actually, I think the supervisor's going to skate. There's a good lesson here for mechanics, because the supervisor in that case told the mechanic to do something that was not in the manual, and he did it, and he signed off for it. And he's the one that's really can never go over there. Are they really going to go looking for him? Probably not. But if he went over there and got in trouble for something else, he would be in deep doo-doo real quick.
Yeah. Any other questions out here, folks?
I'm amazed you don't have any questions. Usually when I go in hangars doing this, I get kicked pretty good. Let's see, what didn't you cover? Oh, enforcements.
Yeah.
The NTSB is the Court of Appeals if the FAA were to take license action against you, or pilots, and actually maritime captains on boats. They did a few of those. Those were interesting. So anybody with a license and the authorities come after your certificate, you can appeal to the NTSB. And the process for airmen is, after the FAA says, give me your license for 30 days, you can appeal the NTSB, and there's time limits that are very strict. So as you're going through that process, make sure you know what your next steps are. You appeal to the NTSB, you get one of our law judges. I think we're down to 4. There was 5, but the amount of enforcement that the FAA has been doing has been on the decline since we've put all these ASAP programs in and all the rest. So the workload's down. But the first stop would be an administrative law judge would hear the case. If either party doesn't like what the law judge says, then you can appeal that to the full board. It's based solely on the record that's already in. You don't get a chance to come back in and talk again, although I tried while I was there. I wanted to have folks come in and explain what they put in the record, but I never made it. So based on the record, the board members will rule. And I will tell you that I found that portion of my job very enjoyable. In the early years, we had a lot of enforcement, so I spent a lot of time on those. And I was told that I have the record number of dissents for opinions, and I also drove a lot of changes. I drove a lot of reversal of decisions at the board level.
So if you're an airman, I'm a mechanic, I'm out working in, let's just say, a general aviation shop, and you are unfortunately the recipient of a letter of investigation because of some potential problem that there was. So what sort of advice could you give to that technician as far as what's their first step in handling the response process?
Depending on the issue, and it varies, but you better get some help. You know, if you don't know somebody that knows the system well, then you need to get an attorney that knows it. And the problem with most maintenance cases is that they're not worth enough money to go out and get one of these attorneys that's going to cost you $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. You know, if you get a 10-day suspension of your license, you're not going to make that much money in 10 days.
That's correct.
So, but there's also the pride thing. It's the mark on your record for a long time. So you need to get somebody that understands it, and it's usually a lawyer. I get calls from people all the time. In fact, within the last, well, actually it was last Friday, I got a call from 5 mechanics at the same time on an issue. There's 5 guys involved, and I'm waiting for some of the paperwork, but it's pretty clear already that they're going to need to get a lawyer. Right,
And
so
the other thing to be cognizant of, I believe, is there's some pretty specific timelines to that whole process, that if you don't respond by a certain time or you don't take this action, then it moves on without the benefit of your input.
it's not only the benefit, sometimes you just lose the whole case. So those time limits are very important. So you need, as soon as if you get a letter, or you know anybody that gets a letter of investigation from the FAA, there's no delay on that. Get moving. Get moving. Reach out for somebody that knows the system, or get an aviation attorney. And I don't mean going and get your brother-in-law's best friend, an aviation attorney. You know, there's probably the National Transportation Safety Board has a bar association. It's not associated with the NTSB, but that's what they call themselves, the NTSB Bar Association. And in that association, there's less than 100 lawyers for the whole country. They understand the system cold. Those are the kinds of guys you want to go after. Right? And depending on the severity, there's probably less than a dozen that I would use. If I was in serious trouble, there's less than a dozen that I would use.
And of course, if you work for a large company, airline, a large MRO or such, you know, those companies will have processes in place and people in place to help work through generally with the individuals, correct?
That's true, as long as your interest and the company interests are parallel. All right? You got to know, though, that if it becomes a question of you or them, you're going under the bus.
Or under the airplane, as it will be.
Because who's paying the attorney? The company. So he's going to represent the company's interest first. If yours happen to fall in the same track, you can coast. You could get a free ride. But if you're off on the side, you may not like the ride you're going to get. So and mechanics are frugal, i.e. cheap. And I tell them, you know what? There are times when you need to spend some money and get your own lawyer.
Good point. Good point. Well, listen, folks, we're going to wrap it up. Thanks a lot for coming and such, and I hope you have a pleasant time at the rest of the expo here. John, are you available? Are you going to be around for a few minutes?
I'm around all day. You have any questions? If you're embarrassed that you didn't want to talk on camera, just grab me. I'm not going anywhere.
Yeah. Thank you very much, John.
Thanks for coming.